Welcome to dialogue series at Infinite Discoveries. And today we are talking about Ukraine. And we have with us Richard Grego and Miguel Rodriguez and myself, Devidatta Mahapatra. And today we'll bring our perspectives to the conflict, which is going on for the last it's more than 1 month, 1 month and I think 20 days or something. So we'll bring our perspectives to the conflict and how different actors in the conflict behave and various implications on domestic, national, and international politics. So if you look at the Ukraine conflict, we have already a lot of debates going on, a lot of articles, a lot of webinars on that conflict. So what we'll do here today, we'll bring perspectives from philosophy, from history, from politics, and from economics, and to bear all those perspectives to understand the conflict in a better way. We hope so. So I come from the background of politics, and my friend Rich comes from philosophy, and my friend Miguel comes from historical background. So if you look at the political aspect of the conflict, it is something which is actually much more contested than we think. But I think I can talk more about that in a couple of minutes. So let me bring my colleagues to the debate. So Rich, what do you think about the conflict?
Wow, yeah, that's a very open-ended question. I guess personally, obviously, I think I share the shock and horror, the daily depictions of man's inhumanity to man that we see, not to mention the apparent, well, I was going to say by almost any political standard, but I guess if we look at it through a realist lens, not necessarily, but I think by most people's political standards and moral standards and ethical standards, a pretty unjust war as well. I mean, if we talk about, I teach courses in just war theory, for instance. And as far as the Western just war theory is concerned, by almost any perspective within that, this would be sort of the archetypal example of an unjust war. So I guess from my perspective, that's pretty much the view I share.
Yeah, so you're talking about political standpoints.
Yeah.
And as you all know, there are major political theories, for example, realism, liberalism, and constructivism. They have their interpretations about the conflict. So if you look at the realist theory, particularly if you apply that to the behavior of Russia, so how do you apply that theory to Russia, Rich?
Well, I'll just say something really quick to start and then shoot back to you and Miguel for a better, maybe strict definition of what we're talking about when we say realism. But I would say and anybody incidentally and originally Aurobindo shared an article by a contemporary political science, political theory, I guess, scholar, Mearsheimer, being his last name, who has gotten a lot of press now. I notice I've seen him in the New York Times and things like that, who comes from a realist perspective on the situation. And his view, interestingly, is that if you look at the situation through a realist lens, the U.S. in a certain way is as much to blame for this situation as Russia is. Because realism is all about geopolitical power politics, like moves on a chessboard. Yeah. And according to this realist, anyway, we made really bad moves prior to this situation that brought it about. Now, having said that, maybe it's a good time, and I think you guys might be better equipped than me, especially you, Aurobindo, to define exactly what we mean when we're talking about realism.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at realism, so their assumption about human nature is very pessimistic. So basically, it's a kind of Hobbesian world the world in which people are necessarily selfish and they think about only themselves and they don't trust other people and they always think about self-fulfillment or self-aggrandizement. And so if you apply that logic, that Hobbesian logic, might is right, or big fish eating small fish to the Ukraine conflict, we'll see that Russia as a big power, it doesn't trust Ukraine, it doesn't trust NATO, it doesn't trust United States of America, because it thinks that they are undermining its national interest. Right? And Russia believes that Ukraine is its geopolitical sphere of influence. In the Russian terminology, they call it near abroad. They're abroad, but at the same time, they're near. And so one of the arguments you were talking about, Mastermeyer and others, they make it that no big power wants another big power in its backyard, right? So that is one of the realist arguments we can apply to Russian behavior. And if you apply further that Russia is making complaint about NATO expansion for the last 20 years, 20, 30
Right.
years.
Yeah.
But if you apply that same logic to Ukraine and United States policy, we'll make the same argument that they don't trust Russia. Right? United States, Ukraine, NATO, EU, they don't trust Russia because Russia has been an authoritarian power. It has been a dictatorship, you can say that. So they think that Ukraine wants to be a democratic country, it wants to be part of EU, it wants to be part of NATO, and as an independent sovereign country, it has every right to do that, right? And so they think by not including Ukraine in EU and NATO, they are leaving Ukraine to the mercy of Russia. They're leaving Ukraine to the mercy of an imperialist power, that is Russia. So that is why we see the conflict going on for the last almost about 50 days, I think, 50 or more than that. And people are dying. So I don't think realism helps us much to understand. I mean, it helps to understand the conflict, but it doesn't provide a solution. At least now, and I mean, if you look at the conflict now, it doesn't provide a solution to the conflict. The ultimate casualty is the people. People are dying. People are suffering. People are fleeing the country. They're dying. Russia is almost devastating. It is putting bombs, missiles almost everywhere in Ukraine. So I think perhaps liberal ideas help us better understand the conflict. Mikhail, maybe you want to chime in now? You want to say something?
Well, I have two things to add to this conversation. Rich, in response to just war theory, I agree. This is very unjust on Russia's part, but it's probably seen as just on Ukraine. I haven't seen for a long time the world galvanized to support Ukraine, not only morally, but militarily. It's almost as if even, I don't know, I haven't really read too many pacifists lately, but it's like nobody's saying that Ukraine shouldn't defend itself militarily, because this is seen almost as a blatant attack on a sovereign nation that didn't ask for war, almost like when Hitler invaded Poland. Hitler and Russia at the time actually invaded Poland to start World War II in Europe.
Yeah.
And it's even different than the American invasion of Iraq in the sense of that Saddam Hussein was even doing saber rattling, even though Iraq was not involved with the 9/11 attacks, as we all know now. there was a lot of saber rattling by the leaders in Iraq. However, in this case in Ukraine, President Zelensky and his cohort were trying to play down any escalation toward
Uh,
an invasion. And
yeah,
so, Mhm.
yeah, I think to that I have one comment.
Yeah,
I think comparing Iraq with Ukraine will be I think tenuous because Iraq was no threat to America. I mean, it was no threat, and there are a lot of stories that that Iraq had nuclear weapons. It was a hoax. It was not. It was not
Right.
true. Right. But let us not talk about that because we are not making that comparison. But I agree with you, Miguel, that Russia has no right to attack an independent, sovereign, democratic country. On that we all agree. But I think if you look at the liberal ideas, liberals are much more hopeful because they're influenced by Immanuel Kant and John Locke and those ideas. It's kind of optimistic portrayal of human nature. People are nice, people cooperate, they collaborate, and they are interdependent, they do trade, they do commerce, and they are democratic Republican ideas. And they also believe in international institutions like United Nations. So if you apply that argument to Ukraine, I think Ukraine will be much more stronger side than Russia, because Ukraine wants to be a democratic country. It wants to be part of European Union and NATO, which are what we call collective security organizations, particularly NATO. But if you apply that logic to Russia's behavior, Russia would say that we also want to do trade with Ukraine. We also want to collaborate with Ukraine, and we have a lot of shared culture, language, history. So there are a lot of similarities to be interdependent and to be collaborative. But I would say that Ukraine will be much more stronger side if you apply the liberal argument.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes I wonder when I have these discussions in some classes like moral and political philosophy and contemporary ethics and just war theory and things like that. One thing I think that's interesting about the liberal political tradition is that simultaneously advantageous and problematic is that it relies on the notion that somewhere written in the heavens someplace, so in the grand course of human destiny, there are these absolute principles that should govern and that do govern, whether we want them to or not, right? No matter whose opinion you're asking, there are these absolutely true precepts and principles, and that's what everything, right, from the civil rights and fundamental rights in the U.S. and Indian constitutions are based on, and the UN Declaration of Rights, right, and Geneva Convention. All these things are based on this notion that these absolute principles, a very liberal sort of idea. Yeah. We didn't really define liberal. Well, actually, Aurobindo defined it pretty well. But what I'm wondering is, and an interesting philosopher and ethicist, I believe her name was Laurie Calhoun, brought this up in terms of just war theory, that she is against, in sort of the Mearsheimer critique only of that specific issue, that if you have, thinking that these general moral realist principles are going to get you out of situations like this, you're being naive, because what'll happen is that anybody who wants to justify their selfish preferences and their selfish desires, whether it's Vladimir Putin or Adolf Hitler or anybody else, is going to appeal to the exact same principles that we do, who oppose them. and they're going to offer a perfectly rational argument about why they are adhering to the UN Declaration and to the Geneva Convention and why we aren't. So it really, I guess, contra what you guys are saying, she argues that these liberal principles really don't do you any good in international affairs. And I don't know, I'd like to ask you guys this. Do you think that current events are kind of proving her right?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, everybody's appealing to the UN and this and that, and they're all arguing that they're on the side of truth, but everybody has their own truth, it almost seems.
That brings me to the second point that I was going to make previously, and I'm glad you brought that question up. That's a perfect question, Rich. I tend to be siding with her in this case because Putin has kind of like, well, he's proven us wrong. The political pundits and experts wrong. We thought that he was going to abide by certain standards and norms, even though he was threatening to invade Ukraine. Nobody thought he was going to do that, even the most, experienced and political scientists and all that, and yet he did. Yeah. What I'm afraid of, what sends chills up my spine is that, and what I've been hearing recently from some other experts, is that perhaps Putin doesn't even have an ideology. He may be a realist, but he has no ideology. I mean, even Hitler had an ideology. Stalin, I think, to a point, had maybe, perhaps preserving communism, what have you. But Putin just seems like he's all out for himself, just for himself. So
that would make him that would make him a pretty thoroughgoing realist. Right. Another assumption of the realist ethos is that there are no such thing as morality. Morality just doesn't apply. It's the law of the jungle. You can't even apply moral principles in international relations. So I don't know. Does that make him any more dangerous than, say, a Stalin or a Hitler, who did possibly have a moral ethos that they claim to share with everybody else? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it boils down to the famous realist principle, might is right. If you look at, I mean, there are many historical examples about that. I mean, if you look at the Gulf War in 1990-91, that time, when Iraq attacked Kuwait, it was United Nations Security Council which approved the American attack, American-led attack on Iraq in 1991, that time. And around that time, we had the end of the Cold War. And what some of the well-known scholars call, we had unipolar moment. We had only one pole, that is led by the United States. And if you look at 2003, I think Miguel was talking about Iraq War. That time, again, United States went to United Nations Security Council for approval to attack Iraq. At that time, the Security Council said no, because it works on the basis of unanimity. But despite that, we had the war, right? So here, realism offers useful lessons that when it suits a nation, when it is useful to use morality, ethics, then realists will be very happy to use that. But if it doesn't help, then they don't care. I mean, they just go and they do whatever they want to do. And there are a lot of examples we can discuss. But I think if you look at Ukraine, I would say it is crash realism that is unfolding, because nobody's talking about dialogue, nobody's talking about peace. And last couple of days, I was following Erdogan of Turkey, the Turkish leader. He tried to do some kind of mediation in Istanbul, and he invited the leaders from Ukraine and Russia. But a couple of days ago, I was talking to one of my Turkish friend, and she told me that Erdogan doesn't have enough support within EU. So I don't think he's going to succeed. I mean, it's unfortunate that the war is going on, and we are living in such a well-connected, integrated, so-called globalized world. And we are all looking at what is going on. People are dying. I mean, there is another argument that the military-industrial complex in all the powerful countries, they are happy that they are sending weapons and they're getting money, but people are dying. I mean, this is unfortunate, but this is going on.
Do you subscribe to that view yourself, either of you guys? That's what's one part of a big force in perpetuating this war? Or actually, probably a good deal of all of the big powers wars over the last few decades. Do you agree with that? Do you think that they really are a motive force behind this?
That is one piece of the puzzle. I mean, that doesn't explain everything. I don't think that explains everything about the war, but that explains at least one part, one piece of the puzzle. Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the news that the Austrian leader, he went to Kremlin, and I think the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, he made all kind of comments about the war. I think the more it prolongs, the more it continues, it will be more protracted. And perhaps, I hope that doesn't happen, perhaps there will be more escalation of the conflict. And Russia, I think it says that if Finland and Sweden, they join NATO, Russia is going to target. I just came across that news. Perhaps that is a kind of just a show of, it's a kind of diplomatic grandstanding. I don't think that may not happen. But I think so as long as the war continues, it's not a good thing. I mean, it is going to prolong, protract, killing more people, perhaps involvement of more powers, and we don't know.
So your question, Rich, is there something behind this, or is the in military industrial complex behind what we're seeing in the Ukraine? I think more likely, perhaps in the Russian sense, or at least I think Putin wanted to show the world that he can be a big world power player and everything, and exercise his military, although I think he didn't realize how poorly it was going to perform. I think on the particularly U.S. side, since the U.S. is sending so many arms to Ukraine, it's a boondoggle for the U.S. military industrial complex right now. I mean, I don't think they're going to have any problems with our economy, inflation, and all that. At least that industry for a while, at least. But yeah, so I don't know if I don't think it was actually by most powers, by NATO, US. I don't think it was intentional, this war. I think this was mostly a Russian-driven offensive,
right?
An invasion. But of course, the winners usually are the people who deal with the weapons, right? To sell the weapons usually, and everybody else loses, unfortunately.
Yeah. But I mean, because you hear about this. I mean, certainly this was a big issue during the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was the accusation that with the Bush administration, you had Dick Cheney's involvement with the military-industrial complex and presumably getting a windfall from the perpetuation of that war. But I was just wondering, you hear about this all the time. and certainly it's not as though I don't believe it, and I don't believe that there could be a lot of influence there. I guess from a moral standpoint, I wonder when we use this grand term "they" about the military-industrial complex, like it's this sort of an anonymous entity sort of floating out there in the ether, that's like a dark force. That they want things to war to perpetuate. But I mean, ultimately, the people who are running the military-industrial complex are human beings, and they presumably they're not all. You don't have to be have your moral conscience excised in order to rise to the top and be a motive force in that industry. Is there real empirical evidence that the military-industrial complex perpetuates these conflicts? Maybe this is too tangential a topic and we don't want to pursue it, but I'm just curious because in this case, for instance, is there a record of lobbying on Capitol Hill that we can really discern that suggests that the military-industrial complex is doing everything they can to perpetuate the war? For instance, the war in Ukraine or the even if you want to go back as far as the war in Iraq. Do we have evidence that that's really the case?
Yeah, I can make some observations on that. But before that, so we are talking about just war in the beginning. And I think this is one of the highly misused terms. Like somebody's just war may not be another's just war, right? And in that context, I was listening to news that the Russian Orthodox Church, the Patriarch Kirill of Russian Orthodox Church, he says that Russia is fighting a just war. I mean, this is highly controversial, highly ambiguous argument. And other day, I was listening to some of the victims of the conflict, like people who are fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. They're going to Poland, Austria, Hungary, other countries. And there's an interview of some of those people. And they say that it is a fight of good against evil. And so that narrative, and a couple of days ago, we had a conference on Holy War in the college. And so these terms, I think, are highly misused, misinterpreted. And I don't think we have a definitive answer to that, definitive solution to that kind of dilemma, that kind of controversy. And about MIC, or military industrial complex, I don't think they are the sole drivers for this conflict. I don't think so. In fact, one of the reasons why Soviet Union collapsed, because they had overgrowth of military industrial complex, and they had undergrowth of economy and political system. It was a highly authoritarian, but highly militarized economy. But you talked about, I think you made a very interesting point, Rich, that did they excise morality from their calculation? Mm-hmm. All these people, I would say yes, to some extent, because look at the war in Yemen, look at the war in Syria, now Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
And I was listening to one argument, one video that there's so many weapons in Yemen. So for the fun, they just fire in the air because they have so many bullets, so many weapons. For fun, to pass time, when they get bored, they just fire in the sky so that they can get some relaxation. And imagine, again, this is a kind of, you can say, hypothetical argument, very idealistic, Gandhian, maybe utopian argument that think there are no weapons. And I think Einstein made that philosophical argument that I don't know what will happen if we have a third world war. But if we have a fourth world war, we'll fight with sticks and stones, right? And that brings to the larger philosophical, moral, ethical question, which we talk about, that there is violence, there is conflict within all of us, somewhere. Right? Because we fight. I mean, not I or you personally, but the soldiers who are human beings, they fight, right? So there's violence, there's conflict somewhere in the individual human being. And particularly Gandhi would make that argument, Mahatma Gandhi. He would say that unless the violence is extirpated from within all of us, then we'll have conflict, violence, and war. But certainly, I mean, it is a very idealistic argument. But certainly, I would say there's kind of degrees, who is more violent, who is less violent. And certainly there are the military industrial complex, they make weapons, not just to keep in the store, they want to sell those weapons to be used. Right?
Yeah. Well, that's pretty ominous.
I agree with Robinda regarding the just war theory. It's more of a religious than political term, and I believe it may have originated with Saint Augustine of Augustus.
A lot of it, yeah.
And the Catholic Church took it up.
Yeah, its origins are, I guess, really classical Rome, Cicero and to the ancient Greeks, some of the ancient Greek philosophy. You could arguably even say Plato and Aristotle, but yeah, I think it's come down to us really, Augustine and Thomas Aquinas really began to systematize it, the idea.
Even Mahabharata talks about that. There's a concept called Dharma Yudh in Mahabharata. That literally means just war. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Miguel, you were saying something.
Yeah.
Oh no, pretty much that was it that I wanted to say. It is more subjective.
I guess though, if we believe in just society principles and the UN Declaration of Rights and constitutional rights and things like that, really the idea of just war would almost logically follow from that, wouldn't it? That there are circumstances that justify war and that don't, and that justify certain kinds of actions as opposed to other actions once you begin a war and then once you end a war. So I don't know. An eye
for an eye makes the whole world blind.
Yeah. And if we do away with those principles and just throw up our hands and say, well, look, realism is true. And, as some critics of just war theory claim that, well, so they're useless anyway, because everybody's going to say that I'm on the side of God or on the side of the angels. We can abandon all those principles completely, but then we have nothing. We have no parameters within which to hopefully eventually try to build some consensus among nations. I mean, do you guys agree with that? It seems as though you do.
Absolutely. So I think I argued somewhere that the major powers, they have a responsibility, the big powers. And I was talking about that when the Second World War ended, the Second World War, and it was the victorious powers, the Allied powers, United States, France, Russia, they all came together and they established United Nations. Right? But unfortunately, if you look at the history of United Nations, there's a study that the major powers, they applied veto power, I think some 240 times. Right?
Yeah.
240 times. So I think there is a tussle, there's a struggle between ideas, ideals, and the practice. So I think there's a wide chasm, there's a wide gap between what we believe, what we say, and what we do. And that applies to the nations. And again, Gandhi comes to my mind. He says that when there is a synchrony or harmony between what we think, what we say, and what we do, then there is real peace. But if you look at the states, they are very apt to say something or to do something, and they call it diplomacy. Right? Diplomacy is basically you say something and you do something else. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That is what is diplomacy, right? And unfortunately, that is the reality. And I think as a forum, we have a lot of scope to tell our neighbors, our colleagues, our society, our state, and our world that believe in good principles is good, but also apply those principles to life and society.
Amen to that. That's true. And I think a lot of these things we're talking about, I mean, the Declaration of Human Rights didn't pop up overnight. It was something that actually it was in the making for probably at the very least 100 years prior. I mean, the European wars of the 19th century helped create some of these institutions for peace, and if not peace, then at least for trying to limit the horrors of war, if you will, where you can use certain types of weapons or chemical weapons or whatever,
Yeah.
But has that stopped countries from doing it? No. But like Rich says, but if we don't even have these institutions that try to police, in a sense, or try to try to bring about some type of humanity into war, if I know that's probably a very, very counterintuitive, or just a really bad term there, but if we do away with all that, we have nothing then.
Yeah, actually, Miguel, so like in international relations theory, both realists and liberals, right, but they both agree on one thing, that international system is anarchy. In that both liberals and realists, they agree that the states operate in a system of anarchy. But the good thing with the liberals is that the states are willing to cooperate. Right? Realists would say they're more skeptic about cooperation, but liberals would say they're willing to cooperate, but at the same time, the system is anarchical. Right? So that's the kind of dilemma, because there is no policeman. Like if I do something illegal, there's a police to take action. But in international politics, there is no policeman. So all the actions are voluntary, and willingly the states have to do what they said they are going to do. So I think there needs to be some kind of fundamental transformation. Not only the states, but also the state leaders, because when you talk about state, it's the leaders who represent the state, right? And I think maybe we'll talk more about that in some other time. But Ukraine is really, I think Ukraine is a kind of a test for not only for all the theories, but also for all the states and leaders, how they are addressing the crisis.
Absolutely. And we're at about that 45 minute mark. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, Dr. Mahapatra and Dr. Grego. It's been fascinating, and we'll continue. This is a series, so this is only part one. So stay tuned for the subsequent parts. We'll bring you more real soon. With that said, do you all have anything else to add before we conclude?
Yeah, last thing I would like to add, that let us all hope that the war ends soon in Ukraine, and people don't die, and Russia ends its invasion, and there's some kind of dialogue and some kind of peace. Yeah.
Rich?
I agree with everything that Aravinda just said. Couldn't say it better to conclude our discussion.
And I say again, amen.
Amen.
Thank you again, gentlemen, and viewers. Thank you. We'll see you again soon. Take care now.
Bye-bye.
And don't forget, hit the like button, subscribe, And join us on our website, www.infinitediscoveries.org. Take care.